Welcome, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Emiliano Salazar. I am the American Indian Law Program Fellow here at Colorado Law. Um, and I work with both Sue Noe and Kristen Carpenter on the implementation project. And we are incredibly happy to have everyone here for the third annual session on preparing for the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Um, this meeting is recorded just so that everyone knows. And we will begin with both Sue and Kristen giving some opening remarks, and then we will continue on with some comments from Keith Harper, former ambassador Keith Harper, who is a current member of the UN Permanent Forum. Then we will move on to Andrea Carmen from the International Indian Treaty Council. Um, and then to Geoff Roth, who is also a member of the UN Permanent Forum. We'll also have comments from Whitney Gravelle, who is the president of Bay Mill Indian Community, Chase Velasquez, who is the Assistant Attorney General of the San Carlos Apache Tribe, and Jennifer Weddle, who is the co-chair of the American Indian Law Practice at Greenberg Traurig. After all of our comments, we will open it up for Q&A from our audience. And you can post questions in the chat. You can use the raise hand function. I'm sure we are all very accustomed to Zoom now, but please send me a message if you are having trouble figuring out how to raise your hand, and I will help you out. But without further ado, I will hand it over to the co-directors of the implementation project, Sue Noe and Kristen Carpenter.
Thanks, Milo. I appreciate it. It's great to be with all of you. And yes, I'm Kristen Carpenter. I'm a professor at the University of Colorado Law School, as well as co-director of the implementation project with Sue Noe. In the interest of time, we decided to split up the moderation. So I'll do the initial comments and get straight to the speakers, and then Sue will moderate the second half of the program. And as many of you know, the implementation project is a joint initiative of the Native American Rights Fund and the University of Colorado Law School, designed to promote advocacy and education on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, especially as it empowers American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians in tribal, national, and international advocacy. As Mila said, this is our third annual Preparing for the Permanent Forum workshop. And as Ambassador Harper will say more later, the theme this year is self-determination with a focus on youth. And the session will take place April 15th through 26th, as usual, at UN headquarters. There's going to be a roundtable meeting with the US State Department on March 14th to coordinate between Indigenous peoples and the United States. And I think Mila will put in the chat a registration link for that meeting if you haven't yet signed up. Sue will talk a little bit more later about that meeting. So just in terms of framing, as most of you probably know, the Permanent Forum's annual session is one of the largest gatherings of Indigenous peoples from all over the world every year. And it's an opportunity for tribes and others to do a few things. First, to take their advocacy to a global stage, bringing attention to fundamental human rights issues, whether that's tribal religious freedoms or remedies for the Indian boarding schools or advancing free, prior, and informed consent, all issues that have come up recently. Secondly, it provides tribes an opportunity to meet and to act in solidarity with Indigenous peoples from other countries, including Aboriginal peoples of Australia, the Sami of the Nordic countries, Nenets in Russia, the Maya of Belize, dozens, maybe hundreds of others. And some of the participants on today's call have had a chance to work in solidarity with Indigenous peoples from elsewhere. And third, I think of the Permanent Forum as providing an opportunity to try to hold both the United States and the United Nations itself accountable through pressure and cooperation, informal and formal dialogue, the tools of diplomacy on Indigenous peoples' issues. To make all this happen, it takes a great deal of preparation for tribal leaders, lawyers, and others. We've noticed that even a lifetime or a career long of advocacy in the federal courts or the US Congress doesn't necessarily give one all the tools that they need to navigate the UN successfully. And to support this work, our project and others, of course, have done this work too, are trying to provide these settings to empower tribes and tribal leaders with information and with the tools of diplomacy. We're about to publish an Indigenous Peoples Guide to the United Nations. It's coming out hopefully before the forum. And in the meantime, today we have this amazing group of speakers to present, comment, and discuss with our group specifically about the annual session of the forum. So I'll introduce either of them with a little bit more detail than Milo provided. And they'll each spend about 10 to 12 minutes with initial presentations. And then, as we said, Sue will moderate the discussion with our tribal leader and tribal lawyer representatives. And so first, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Keith Harper, former ambassador and permanent representative of the United States to the UN Human Rights Council. Mr. Harper is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and currently serves as a state-nominated member of the UN Permanent Forum, as well as a partner at Jenner & Block. He was previously an attorney at the Native American Rights Fund and represented the plaintiff class of over 500,000 individual Indians in the case of Gravelle versus Salazar, which settled for over $3 million against the United States. He continues a career that's very active in justice for Indian tribes, including ICWA litigation, as well as in international matters. After Mr. Harper, we will hear from Ms. Andrea Carmen, a member of the Yaqui Nation, who serves as executive director of the International Indian Treaty Council, where she began her work in 1976. Ms. Carmen is well known for her presence at the United Nations and for advancing voices of Indigenous peoples on issues ranging from food sovereignty and sustainable development to the rights of children under state custody, repatriation and cultural rights, a matter that we worked on together, environmental justice, and of course, treaty rights. She recently served as on the facilitative working group for the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform of the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's really a mouthful, but it means that she was representing Indigenous peoples on climate change issues at the United Nations. And then our third initial panelist will be Mr. Geoff Roth, an Indigenous nominated member of the UN Permanent Forum and a longtime advocate in the areas of health and urban Indian issues. He was executive director of the National Council of Urban Indian Health and then held a key appointment in the Department of Health and Human Services during the Obama administration. He's a Standing Rock Sioux tribal descendant and was deeply involved last year in the Permanent Forum's study on Indigenous determinants of health. And he followed up with the World Health Organization and other bodies, and I think can share with us some of the ways that the work at the forum can impact international advocacy. He recently started an organization providing culturally competent technology solutions to improve American Indian and Alaska Native healthcare. With these introductions, and we'll save the other three for a little bit later, I will pass the floor to my friend Keith Harper. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kristen. It's good to be with everybody today. I think I'm going to talk about three areas, two of which Kristen suggested, and so I generally follow the sound wisdom of following Kristen's recommendations. And one that I think it's important, I think, to think about as we talk about the forum or any UN institution, frankly. So the first is like, how do we view advocacy at an institution like this? The second issue I want to address is the theme for this year, which is self-determination. And the third is what I think is maybe the most important thing that Indigenous peoples can do, and members of the forum can do, and frankly, member states can do, and that is to make the forum a more effective institution to addressing the political concerns of Indigenous peoples. So on the first, I guess the main point I want to make here is that oftentimes we talk about a lot of these things in terms of rights. We talk about them as far as legal instruments and legal instrumentalities and legal bodies. And I guess the first point I want to make is that you ought to think of this not as a legal body, but as a political body, as a political tool. That to the extent that there's nothing binding, unless you're before the UN Security Council, the ICC, or some other juridical bodies, there is nothing binding that comes out of the international system. And so you have to look at these things as how do I utilize this political tool to elevate my issue? And that counsels towards an approach of both helping your clients, the people you represent, manage expectations. There's not going to be when we go into court, we get a court order, and we can enforce that court order, and we can seize assets. And as former President Trump is recognizing right now, you sometimes have to put up a bond just to appeal the case. So there are real consequences and hard law and hard means to enforce law. But in the international system, except for in the rare institutions that I've identified, and certainly with the permanent forum, this is in legal terms, but it's a political instrumentality, and that doesn't mean that it's not useful, and it can be useful. And I think some ways to make it more useful, given how the forum works, is having your documentation be concise, have a realistic expectations for your ask. What are you recommending that the forum do, and what are you recommending that the forum recommend a state do, if there's a recommendation of a state? And it has to be precise and specific, because to the extent it's just nebulous is to the extent that it's going to become nebulous in the report, and the recommendation is going to become nebulous, and the responses, if any, is going to become nebulous. So it's incumbent on the advocate, in my judgment, to make sure that it follows certain basic advocacy rules to increase the efficacy of the work that you're doing. So self-determination, look, I think the forum this year, we chose self-determination because, in my mind, it sort of goes back to first principles. Self-determination is everything, right? I mean, self-determination is about who gets to decide. It's about whose institutions get to decide. It's about what we call in the United States tribal sovereignty. It's about free, prior, and informed consent. It's about everything. All of that fits within this concept of self-determination, because it's about if it's going to impact a tribal community, if it's going to impact an indigenous community, then it is the indigenous community itself that ought to have the say on how to handle that, and what institutions it should go to, and what considerations should be brought to bear. So there's so I think that this is an opportunity to, whatever issue you're caring about, to sort of think about how you can cognize it into these base first principle terms of who gets to decide. And if you, in my judgment, look, there's a couple of key concepts in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, certainly free, prior, and informed consent. There's others. But the one thing that is clear most in anything is that indigenous peoples, contrary to much of history, should get to decide on things that impact them, impact their members, impact their lands, impact their communities, their institutions, their language, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it is about who's the decision maker, and that's what self-determination is. It's that these entities, these government bodies, the representatives of indigenous peoples themselves should be the ones that get to decide. So I just offer that because I think that is the spirit in which the forum agreed to adopt this. I think you can see it as a bit of a look back, a where have we been, where are we now, where are we going, on this central question of who gets to decide. So I want to spend the rest of my time on what I think is the most important issue facing the forum. And let me make one more point on self-determination. The Washington Post today did a story about Oak Flats and the transmission line, and it basically said, the headline was, tribes opposing the Biden agenda on clean energy, or words to that effect. But if you actually read the article, it's not about indigenous communities, tribal communities opposing green energy. In fact, Berlin Jose, the chairman of Non-Autumn, very clearly says, we support renewable development, but we have our own perspective and interest in it, and we should have a say in how it happens. And I think that is an idea that is embedded in this idea of self-determination, that it is Non-Autumn, this San Carlos Apache, it is whatever tribal community, whatever indigenous community is being impacted, that has to have a central, real voice in the decision-making process. So let me turn to what I've described as the most important challenge, and that is the efficacy of the forum. The forum can be one of two things, in my mind. It can be a place where indigenous peoples from around the world come and talk about their grievances, have cultural exchanges as well, have a sense of brotherhood and sisterhood, and that's all good. But if it is going to be a political tool, then it has to do its work far better than it's doing it. Period. Full stop. Because recommendations made by the forum are by and large being ignored by both UN institutions and states. And some of that is on the forum itself. And I know that there are other forum members that agree with me on this. And I think that we will have enough energy to have a reform effort. But I'm not going to speak for them. I'm giving you my personal views. This to me is the most important thing, because the other thing the forum can be is not just a place where you voice your grievance, but where you get your grievances addressed in some kind of political process. That doesn't mean you get to win everything you bring up. In fact, you're unlikely to ever have an institution like that. But at least you have processes whereby they lead to your recommendation being heard and your recommendation being responded to, and that there is a realistic expectation that states and UN bodies respond to the recommendations of the forum. So what do we need to do? We need to have a better report. The report has to lay down with greater specificity exactly what we're recommending and to whom we're recommending it to. We need to have a report that is accessible for states, because if it's not accessible, all these state missions are doing a million things, and they're not going to have the time to go and dig through a bunch of the reports and read things that are not germane to them, and try to be responsive. So the job is on us to do a better report, and I, for one, am going to be pushing for that for my other members of the forum. The recommendation should be clear. They should be limited per state, in my judgment, because if you have 15 recommendations for state X, State X is not going to respond to 15 recommendations. They just don't have the bandwidth at their mission. So I don't know if the number is 3, I don't know if the number is 4, but limit the amount of recommendations, and that should be a decision made by the permanent forum members. We can talk about other things, but when it comes to specific recommendations in which we expect a response, then to me it has to be limited. There should be a direct communication with each mission of the recommendations and a very clear understanding of the expectations on the time period of responsiveness. And look, we're not creating out of whole cloth. This is not sui generis. Every few years, each member state of the UN goes through what is called the Universal Periodic Review. And the UPR is in Geneva before the Human Rights Council. You go through it every 3 years approximately. And during that process, states and NGOs make recommendations to states, and then there's a process by which those recommendations are documented. States say whether or not they're going to implement them, they accept them in whole or in part, and then the time period in which they're going to address them. And that means the state is free to say, I disagree with your recommendation and I'm not going to agree to implement it. But that's fine. At least there is a process by which they have had to consider the question in their foreign ministry, at least, if not their government as a whole, and then respond accordingly within this process. And that over time will create a more effective institution. And that is, I think, what Indigenous peoples will benefit from. And look, I'm sensitive to the fact that at this most recent permanent forum, we had a bunch of young people from a variety of Indigenous communities making their case. But if they see that this is an ineffective institution to getting actual changes on the ground, getting their issues addressed, you know, I fear that over time they're going to abandon the institution because it's not a real place where you can find movement on things that you care about and that are important to your Indigenous community. So I think this is a most important job. I think it is a very doable job. I think part of this is things that the forum has to do. I think part of this can be supported by those representing Indigenous peoples who come to the forum with clear, concise, definitive recommendations to a particular state or a particular UN agency, because that will facilitate our capability to get this done. So I think acting all together and having a diplomatic approach towards the missions so that they will agree on specific expectations of responsiveness, I think are entirely doable, but we just need to do it in short order. And I think there's no better time than in this session of the forum. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. That was terrific. And I think you've given us so much that we'll hopefully follow up on in the rest of the conversation. Just to highlight or underscore 2 points, your comments about the youth are particularly well taken because the theme is about self-determination with attention to the issues of youth. And I think that's a great point for us all to keep in mind. And also the idea of encouraging states and the UN system itself to follow up on recommendations and the multifaceted nature of that, improving the calls, improving the report, and then improving the follow-up. We have circulated the last few years of reports from the forum, and one thing we might think about as we anticipate the roundtable with the State Department and upcoming engagements with the federal government is, which recommendations from last year's report or the year before, whether it's about Oak Flat, there was one about Line 5, there were several about health. Which ones do we want to pick up and really encourage the United States to respond to when it makes its interventions from the floor this year? Because as I think Keith has suggested, this should be an ongoing dialogue. The tribes shouldn't just go and make their statement and never hear back from the United States. And of course, the same goes for other states. But for the tribes here, the primary concern might be the US. With that, I will pass the floor to Andrea Carmen. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Keith, for a good start. I'm going to see if my screen shares. Can you see it? Is it there?
Yes, we can see it. Thank
Oh,
you.
great. Okay. I never know how this is going to work. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I myself have been to every meeting of the Permanent Forum and went through also the years that we were negotiating with states and other Indigenous peoples for what we wanted here. So that's my perspective on this. This is a picture of the opening session from last year. And the opening session is always in the hall of the UN General Assembly. This isn't where most of the meeting takes place, but this way you can see how it looks. And that's the current chair up there on the screen, Dario Mejia, an Indigenous representative from Colombia. Yeah, I just want to take a step back and talk about how this process began so long ago, back in 1977. The very first UN conference on discrimination against Indigenous peoples of the Americas was held in Geneva. And one of the core recommendations / demands of the Indigenous nations, mainly treaty nations that were participating, was to create a body for Indigenous peoples at the United Nations, which there wasn't one then. And so in 1982, the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations, we weren't peoples then in the UN system. There's some reasons for that and why that became such a central struggle, including the right to self-determination, as Keith referenced. It was the first body that was dedicated to discussions of Indigenous peoples at the UN. And out of that was born the variety, the three main mechanisms that we have now. And we began to talk about a more permanent and higher placed body back in the UN Working Group, because we knew a working group could be easily eliminated, and it was pretty far down in the UN system in Geneva. And sure enough, back in 2006, it did get eliminated when the UN human rights system was revised, and it was replaced by what's called the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. At the same time, we continued to work to bring about this body, the Permanent Forum, which was established in 2001, before even the working group went away. And this is one of the rapporteurs. The mandate, which is what the UN creates to tell any UN body or system what they're supposed to do, what they can work on, was as an advisory body to the United Nations Economic and Social Council, which is really important to recall. And that gives us opportunities, but it also limits what the Permanent Forum is going to do. And the mandate designated 6 areas. Human rights is one of them, but also economic, social development, culture, environment, education, and health. All issues that are very important, in fact, vital for the survival of our peoples and nations on the ground. So it also went on in the mandate to say what the Permanent Forum can do. It provides advice and recommendations to this council, means ECOSOC, raises awareness and promotes integration and coordination of activities in the UN system relating to Indigenous peoples, and prepares and disseminates information, the report, for example. Now, really quickly, I don't have a lot of time to go over 50 years of history, but I want to highlight a few things that those of us that were actually working on bringing this body about, what we wanted and what we ended up with. So we wanted a higher level placement in the UN system than the working group we had, and we achieved that. It got moved directly under the Economic and Social Council in New York. We wanted it to be more permanent because, of course, the working group was easily eliminated back in 2006. We wanted half of the experts to be Indigenous peoples selected by Indigenous peoples themselves. So I have a check and an X. We got half the experts as Indigenous peoples. They're not representatives, though. They're independent experts. And we can nominate them, but at the end of the day, it's the states that select all of them, Economic and Social Council and the president of ECOSOC. So sometimes we get the ones we nominate and sometimes we don't. And we wanted a strong mandate. We envisioned a body that could send, UN helicopters in to stop a mine or, assist an Indigenous peoples whose rights were being violated. Of course, we didn't get that at all. Human rights is just one of the 6 areas, and it's not a human rights complaint body. We have those in the treaty bodies, the special rapporteurs. It's very hard to get specific human rights issues. They can be put on the floor, but in terms of what the permanent forum can do, very little about specific human rights issues. And we also wanted, of course, to be called a Forum on Indigenous Peoples. And we still, to this day, despite the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, have not been able to get the name changed. Also, it's important in the UN Declaration, the Permanent Forum is highlighted as a body along with others and states that have an obligation to implement the UN Declaration, but it is named specifically, and that's a very important role that we need to remember, is how to take the UN Declaration and achieve its implementation, especially within the UN system, by using the Permanent Forum. So important areas for participation. You can make statements on the floor, 2 to 3 minutes. Last year, they cut us down to 2 minutes. So you get to the nitty gritty, there. And also interactive dialogue statements. There are different kinds of agenda items, but the time is limited on both. So you prepare, you practice, and you time yourself. The mic goes dead after the designated time, just when you're reaching your crescendo of your core demand. So practice and time yourself and read at a medium pace. Prioritize your key objectives, which Keith also mentioned. Very important. What is the most important thing you're gonna do there? What is the most important thing you're gonna say? What is your recommendation? You meet with states. They're really happy to meet with you. The US is going to expect that tribal leaders from the US ask them, let's go have a coffee, or when's a good time to talk? Also, UN agencies. You want to talk to UNESCO or UN Food and Agriculture Organization, that's a good place to do it. And the human rights experts. You can set up a meeting with the Rapporteur on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, for example. You can organize and participate in side events on key issues. You can make links with other Indigenous peoples working on things you care about. I advise you to submit your recommendations in writing to the members and the rapporteur, which means the designated person doing the report, member of the Permanent Forum. Give them your recommendation in writing. As Keith said, short, sweet, and to the point, because you want to get it in the report. And you can meet with the Permanent Forum member from your region and also the issue focal point. Each one of them works on a certain issue. Find out who's working on health, if that's what you want to talk. May not be the representative from your region. And commit to follow up from the report. I can't say how important that is. Interactive dialogues. I just wanted to highlight the chair of the MRIP and the special rapporteur, who will be having interactive dialogues Monday of the first week. And you can ask them questions, you can talk about the work that they've done, their studies, etc. I have just a few more minutes, but I want to highlight some key issues that we were able to achieve working with the Permanent Forum. This does make a difference on the ground if you are strategic. First is, the UN Declaration. This Article 11 talks about repatriation of Indigenous peoples that were taken without their free, prior, informed consent, their sacred items and human remains, or in violation of their laws, traditions, and customs. Very important. This is just one of 2 places in the UN Declaration that mentions the word laws, recognizes we have laws about the way our sacred items have to be treated, where they can be kept. This is a picture of our sacred Yaki Masokova in a museum in Sweden, a national museum that we found each other in 2003 and worked for almost 20 years to return. I want to compliment and thank again Kristen Carpenter for her work to assist us. This is Article 12 of the Declaration that talks about the creation of a mechanism to ensure the return of our sacred items. And we know this is an issue that affects almost every Indigenous people from around the world. We were able, after the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, again committed to create a mechanism to ensure the repatriation of our sacred items and human remains. The Permanent Forum had two. The first one was 3 hours, which is, hard to get that time, but it was an international consultation on repatriation. And the Permanent Forum uplifted this issue for all of us. We ended up having to take it as a country review item to the expert mechanism, but the Permanent Forum continued to support this, calling on UNESCO and other bodies, as well as the states involved. This is a meeting we had with our tribal chairman, speaking to the government of Mexico and also the members of the expert mechanism at a meeting of the Permanent Forum. And there was also an expert seminar called to help to advance this. I'm speaking, and next to me is Peter Yucopicio, our fantastic tribal chairman of the Pascua Yaqui tribe, and also Yaqui cultural leaders and political leaders from Mexico as well. And finally, because of the Permanent Forum brought it back on the table, Sweden hadn't moved. In 2022, we achieved the repatriation in Sweden of our sacred items. They returned 26 sacred items to us. But this is important. To create the mechanism, UNESCO hasn't really done anything at all. And even though they were called on by not just the Permanent Forum, but also the Human Rights Council to start to move on this, we brought it back to the Permanent Forum, and they made a very strong recommendation in 2022, telling UNESCO to get going on this and reminding them of their previous recommendations. I want to talk about one other issue that we've made. I hope I have time, just briefly, that where we've made major progress through the Permanent Forum. And that's using Article 29 of the UN Declaration about free, prior, informed consent about the release of hazardous materials on our territories without our free, prior, informed consent, including banned pesticides, mining waste, mercury, and other toxic chemicals that are affecting our health and the health of our future generations. This is a picture of a lithium mine that was approved. The big issue right now, a lot of what we're dealing with is transition minerals, including at Oak Flats. It's called that there. And this is an active mine in Sonora, Mexico, affecting our territories there, one of the largest in the world. We also highlighted Article 22 that calls for a halt of violence, all forms of violence against Indigenous women and children. In 2012, we held the second of 3, and we're about to have the 4th this year, of the International Indigenous Women's Symposium on Environmental and Reproductive Health. And they defined for the first time the concept of environmental violence as a form of violence against Indigenous women and girls. The Permanent Forum was the first UN body that recognized this term as a new form of violence being recognized that was impacting Indigenous women and girls around the world in 2012 at their expert group meeting. They, again, one of the issues that we're dealing with in our Yaqui Nation is the international trade of banned pesticides. And the Permanent Forum followed up on this and called for a amendment in the International Code of Conduct on Pesticides that would recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples under Article 29 to free, prior, informed consent. This is the recommendation in 2022. And we went to the joint meeting on pesticide management. They took this recommendation seriously. This is the UN Food and Agriculture Organization Pesticide Division, and agreed that they would make this amendment. So we're working on it now. That's a huge, huge gain because of the permanent forum. And the last one I want to highlight is General Recommendation 39 that just got adopted September 2022 of the Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. This is their recommendation on Indigenous women and girls. And they use the term environmental violence twice in this general recommendation of a UN treaty body, all because, well, because of Indigenous women calling for this recognition, but the permanent forum was the one that recognized it and pushed it up until the end. So I just want to end again with highlighting the theme for this year. And these are some of our youth that have participated in the past. We very much appreciate the recognition of the importance of youth. There is an Indigenous Youth Caucus at the Permanent Forum, a global caucus that I encourage any of you that are bringing youth to encourage their participation, because that way they can get together with youth from all the regions. And I just want to say one last thing, bring it back to the importance of our follow-up. When we get something in the recommendation, we have to then take that to the next step. It's great if the UN bodies can help us or the states listen to us, but brothers and sisters, it's going to be us that makes this happen. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks for sharing your incredible wisdom and experience on how it's done. You were there before probably all of us were, and created a path for us to follow. And you've also been so effective with the Yaqui people and with IITC in some of the examples you shared. So thank you. I'd like to turn to Mr. Jeffrey Roth for the third presentation, and take it away, Geoff.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate hearing Keith and Andrea go before, so thank you very much. Again, my name's Geoff, as Kristen said. My father's family is from the Standing Rock Reservation, lived both in North Dakota and South Dakota. My dad was relocated actually off the reservation to Portland, where I grew up in the urban Indian community there. I seem to be spending more and more time volunteering doing this work. You can get involved and it can really take up a lot of time, which I enjoy it. I enjoy it, but it does take up a lot of time. I own a consulting firm where I work on tribal health issues, IHS issues, and urban Indian health issues as well with tribes and organizations. So, I wanted to go over some of the basics, which I think Andrea already did mostly. One of the things that I wanted to mention was that, within the forum, all decision making has to be done on a consensus basis. And that can often, just actually in the last session itself, there were several times where individuals would, absolutely put their foot down and not allow certain things to be put into the report or other issues to happen. And I think that's a real disservice, honestly, to the forum as a whole. I think that we should be able to have, voting rights in order to make decisions of recommendations to be considered, so that I know there is principles of the UN and how they operate, but to me it seems like a way that can often hamper our ability to get work done. The forum was really first created to address concerns that Indigenous people brought, and then to take those recommendations, both the ECOSOC and the UN agencies and member states as a whole, and to work to promote assurances that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is respected for all of its protections. I also really identify and respect Keith's perspective on the nature of the mechanisms within the UN system as being political and not necessarily binding. I think most of us understand that and recognize that. I think that's very important I try and rely very heavily on, what we do have. Including FPIC and the Declaration, as much as possible in the work with the UN agencies. The UN system has I would say, outsized influence in many other countries around the world. And I think by, participating from the US and other countries, we have an ability to really affect the policy at the UN level that has this outside influence, that it can improve the lives of our Indigenous people globally. So I think that's very important. But I also very much agree and identify with his remarks specifically on the reporting mechanism itself, the effectiveness of the reporting mechanism, and the need to follow up, and the ongoing dialogue that needs to be occurring between UN agencies and member states and Indigenous people around the issues that are identified. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of recommendations that exist in this sphere now, that's been going on for 24 years this year. The effectiveness of all of those still existing. Some of them are in effect, some of them have been dispensed of, but there's really no clear way to continue monitoring and understanding where they are. We started, the forum met at the end of our preparation period last year to have a conversation about this, about the effectiveness of the forum itself and how we can potentially improve that, and to evaluate the effectiveness of the forum. There are members that are very against that, including former and current members that are concerned about having a conversation on effectiveness, because they feel like if we determine that we haven't been effective, they're going to get rid of the whole system. In my mind, if we're not doing anything, then, why does the system exist in the first place? It's not just about the system existing, it's about the system being able to affect systemic change across the system and across the globe for our Indigenous people. So that aside, I'll talk a little bit about the theme itself, the right to self-determination in the context of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and talk a little bit also about some reports that I have been working on. So the right to self-determination involves several aspects of our lives as Indigenous people. And it also creates the foundation of our Indigenous determinants of health studies. That we as Indigenous people approach life in a holistic way, as an equilibrium of spirituality, traditional medicine, biodiversity, and the interconnectedness of all that exists is really laying the foundation for how we've thought about health. Just listening to Andrea right there, the repatriation of those cultural items affects the health and wellness of our communities. Having our cultural items, having our languages, and having our environment be livable are all parts that are tremendous influences and factors that influence our overall health and wellness. So, it's important that in this work also, we ensure that there's the recognition of the UN Declaration, as well as its the principles of free, prior, and informed consent. Over the past year, we've seen some really good progress, I think, on health, which I'm excited about and excited to talk about. We saw, thanks to decades of advocacy that's occurred from Indigenous people, the Health of Indigenous Peoples resolution passed the World Health Assembly's 76th Assembly in 2023, in May of 2023. The resolution was initially presented at the UN Permanent Forum by the government of Brazil, and it was also co-sponsored by the United States and other countries. It was also supported by leadership from Indian country here in the United States, both at the World Health Forum itself, the World Health Assembly. We held a side event also at EMRIP about the resolution in Geneva. So specifically, the resolution calls for the creation of an Indigenous Peoples Global Plan of Action to be developed and presented to the World Health Assembly in 2026. It also specifically calls for and calls on the WHO to begin providing technical assistance upon request from member states on national plans for the promotion, protection, and enhancement of the physical and mental health of Indigenous peoples. And then also, most importantly, I think the third part of the resolution calls for ensuring that there are strategic lines of action that are specifically for the improvement of the health of Indigenous people included in the 14th WHO General Program of Work, which is they're working on right now. And that general program of work really spans 2025 through 2028. So that's basically what the WHO will be working to accomplish during that time frame. You know, it's really important that we're involved and meaningfully involved in a substantial fashion in the creation of this to ensure that our rights and perspectives are respected and protected and help guide the work. We've been working to create platforms and tools to ensure that we're heard on all the technical decision-making and policy formulating aspects of this. So a little bit about the Indigenous Determinants of Health report and how it's come about. At the 21st session 2 years ago, the concept of Indigenous Determinants of Health was introduced by the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus that Andrea was talking about earlier, when they requested to the forum that we investigate and develop a framework that is under the constructs of indigeneity as a determinant of health for Indigenous people. And then last year, a group that I'm working with, the Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance, came together and wrote a report and study specifically identifying what the Indigenous Determinants of Health are and providing a framework or a lens through which we can expand and explain the interconnectedness of the life of Indigenous people. So this year, we have another study coming out. It's the Indigenous Determinants of Health will be releasing a second study providing practical guidance and tools for agencies to incorporate culturally safe structures to change and create this fertile ground for improving the health and wellness of Indigenous peoples from a rights-based perspective of Indigenous people. The Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance is made up of 22 Indigenous individuals that are academics and researchers. We have politicians, community members, and community leaders. There's 3 of us that are members of the Permanent Forum, and we represent all 7 of the global Permanent Forum regions across the globe. This group has worked to draft both of these studies and has been continuing to work to get this work recognized in different agencies. The studies are really a response to 2 fundamental circumstances that we saw across the system. One was, an apathy to approach Indigenous people's health in a holistic manner. People don't quite understand that concept and have a difficult time thinking about Indigenous health and how it's involved in all of these different mechanisms and concerns. And then an urgent need to educate agency officials and state actors on the fact that our Indigenous issues must not be grouped together with other minority issues. This has been a big issue lately. This is because Indigenous communities have an all-inclusive approach and thus make decisions in a different manner than the dominant culture or other minority populations. And because most agency officials find it difficult to perceive these kind of cultural nuances, they must insist oftentimes on minoritizing Indigenous people and Indigenous issues and grouping us with local communities or grouping us with other stakeholders groups and not necessarily rights holders groups in the context of the UN system. And that's a real problem that we've been trying to address. The framework itself directly addresses the lack of education and awareness and infrastructure across the UN system. In the US specifically, this past year, the National Indian Health Board and the National Congress of American Indians have adopted this Indigenous Determinants of Health framework as an operational framework for their work. We've also seen support from journals such as the Lancet Journal, Harvard School of Public Health, Planetary Health Alliance have been adopting this policy as how they work with Indigenous peoples or recommend working with Indigenous peoples globally. And again, like I said before, it's rooted in the Declaration and FPIC principles. And it really moves forward this concept of indigeneity as an overarching determinant of health by providing the foundation for 33 risk and protective factors that are the unique circumstances that are faced by Indigenous people. I'm happy to say that, we were able to work with the WHO Office of Social Determinants of Health, and so far, their report that will be coming out this year to update the social determinants of health does have that recognition and acknowledgement of indigeneity as a social determinant of health. We're very excited about that and hoping that it continues to stay in the drafting before it comes out. Hopefully it'll come out by this fall. We've been hearing that for a couple of years now. We really approached the first study thinking about, holistic healing and the health of Mother Earth and how we need to re-indigenize concepts for our ability to, in order to approach Indigenous people's health. And then in this second study, which is titled Improving the Health and Wellness of Indigenous Peoples Globally, how to operationalize these Indigenous determinants of health, we focus on guidance on the systemic and structural modifications that are needed to accelerate change in a culturally safe and concrete manner. The guidance incorporates components on Indigenous representation and ensuring we have representation and meaningful engagement across the UN system or across potentially member state agencies or other agencies, incorporation of meaningful interventions and approaches, and equitable integration of Indigenous research and evaluation methodologies, land ownership and environmental management, and then also ensuring optimal participation in policymaking cycles. To me, I think representation is our biggest issue right now in order to ensure that we have systemic change, or we create the case for systemic change. We need substantial Indigenous representation in high-level advisory bodies. I know Keith and I have talked about that several times, about substantial representation in technical and scientific work groups, and decision-making and policy formulation discussions that occur across the system. We need to ensure that our frameworks, such as our health frameworks in the environment and biodiversity conversations, are included across the UN system in those conversations, and to ensure that there's representation in the WHA resolution implementation plan. So I've started to have some conversations with the State Department. I see that Michael's here, and HHS. I appreciate Michael for all your assistance with that. And we're excited to ask us for some support from the United States, specifically potentially in some staffing in different agencies, as well as some other requests we had about the United States supporting these efforts to ensure representation occurs. And I'm excited about those. And then, I would be happy to engage with anybody here on any of these issues and any other messaging that may be helpful. And thank you. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Geoff, and thanks to all our panelists so far. I really appreciate all that. What I'm hearing so far is it's really fantastic. A couple of points are about how the Permanent Forum can become a better tool for Indigenous peoples, and then of course how we can make better use and more effective use of the Permanent Forum in our advocacy, and really appreciate all the examples that have been provided so far. Now we're going to turn it over to our invited commentators. We have 3 commentators who have experience on the ground working on these issues, taking issues to the Permanent Forum and other international fora to try to advance issues at the international level as well as domestically. And so I'm going to introduce our commentators now. First up, we have President Whitney Gravelle, who is president of the Bay Mills Indian Community. She's also served as chief judge of the Bay Mills Tribal Court and in-house counsel for Bay Mills. She presently sits as chair of the Secretary of the Interior's Secretary's Tribal Advisory Committee, and as I mentioned, has worked on issues at the international level. Next up, we have Chase Velasquez, who's a member of the White Mountain Apache tribe. He's Assistant Attorney General in the Department of Justice at the San Carlos Apache tribe. He's also the tribe's Special Assistant United States Attorney for the District of Arizona and is a judge for the White Mountain Apache Tribal Court of Appeals. And then we have Jennifer Weddle, who is principal shareholder and co-chair of Greenberg Traurig's American Indian law practice. And much of her practice focuses in the areas of tribal economic development and natural resources. She has wide-ranging experience as both a litigator and a negotiator. So I'm going to turn it over to President Gravelle as our first commentator. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Ani Buju, everyone. My name is Whitney Gravelle, and I've really been taking quite a few notes as we've been going through the presentations because I probably have the least amount of experience when it comes to advocacy before the Permanent Forum, and have been learning really since we first participated last year and had the opportunity to join everyone in New York City. One of the big key points that I want to highlight, which has been a little bit of an ongoing theme in all of the presentations, is the political nature of the Permanent Forum and the additional advocacy that you can use as a result of those recommendations. When Bay Mills Indian Community was first determining whether or not we were going to attend the Permanent Forum, we really were looking at it as an additional step that could be taken outside of the federal consultation processes that we were engaged in on specific issues. For folks who are not familiar, tribal nations in the United States usually engage in tribal consultation with state and federal agencies when addressing an issue. Sometimes we may litigate over those issues, or other times we may participate as cooperating agencies on a specific issue. But when you start to reach roadblocks within those domestic forums, or you're not seeing adequate results from your consultation before state and federal agencies, I think it's something that tribes should really start to take into consideration, is this third advocacy step, which is within the international forum and the international stage. This was not something that was on our radar, really, because we were so used to the domestic processes that every tribe is familiar with here in the United States and typically participates in terms of working on advocacy. So participating in the Permanent Forum and then making those decisions has 100% been helpful, and I think really illuminates a lot of the issues that are occurring throughout Indian country, not only on behalf of my tribal community, but also other communities across the United States. One of the key things that we learned is in receiving recommendations from the Permanent Forum and then reaching out to those other UN bodies, whether it be CERD or receiving a recommendation from the special rapporteur himself, we were then able to take those recommendations and reignite conversation with the state and federal agencies that we had previously been engaged in consultation with. So it opens up not only an additional pathway for leveraging those consultation processes, but it also highlights different issues, because on the domestic framework, you're not usually talking about human rights issues. You're not talking about pan-Indigenous issues. You know, how is an issue impacting both the United States and Canada or Mexico, for example? And when you're able to take a more broader view and really pull people out of the minute details that sometimes you can get trapped in, they start to understand that, you know, yes, there's legal framework, yes, there's laws, yes, there's regulations, but there's also policy decisions that drive the decision-making process involved in any specific issue that a tribe may be working on. And being able to pull those out and really highlight and affirm the overarching policy of the administration or the state or federal agency has been extremely helpful when we worked on these issues. One thing that I've learned and am working on this year is you can't just do it once. You know, when you're working on an issue, it takes years and years of advocacy. And so if you attend the permanent forum, you know, once, you know, you should plan to attend it again and again and again, and really set up that advocacy as part of your normal workload, you know, within your community and within your tribal nation, so that you are making sure that your voice continues to be heard. Because like it was said, it's a political system. You know, there are going to be new members of the forum. There's going to be new members of state or federal agencies when you engage them. And so you should absolutely make sure that you're including international advocacy as part of your overall advocacy strategy when addressing an issue. And so those are some of the things I've learned and wanted to share with everyone here, because it is different from domestic to an international stage. And I'll be happy to answer any questions when we have the opportunity later on. So thank you.
Thank you, President Gravelle. Those are really excellent points and really highlight the practical impacts of working at the Permanent Forum and the practical realities of what it takes to actually do that and make it pay off. Okay, so next we're going to turn to Chase Velasquez. Chase, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you I want to thank NARF and my former employer, University of Colorado, for arranging this and for inviting me. I know pretty much everyone. I know we're limited on time, so I'm going to try to be short. But one, I think what I want to emphasize is from the comments that I heard from the current members on the forum, I just want you guys to know that I think you all are underestimating the value and power that the Permanent Forum does have. I say that because as a tribal attorney who participated in the forum last year with my client, the St. Croix Apache tribe, on advocating on the failure of the United States to comply with international standards and passing statutes that authorize the transfer of oak flag to a foreign mining giant, which the tribe holds sacred. We went there to advocate that before the forum. And I can tell you right now that it was a huge, huge success. I want to really thank the forum members for your help on that, and just know that your efforts and assistance does have impacts within the Indian country. And I think the biggest takeaway is more tribal attorneys and tribal leaders need to continue to unite to use these international tools. Now, I'm glad Keith said tool, because it is a tool. And I'm glad that Greg is also on the call, because, you know, my former professor, the late Bill Rice, used to always say, you got to learn the international arena. You got to learn it inside and out, because either way, it's just another tool to use as if you were in state court, federal court, or even the executive branch. So we approached, we attended the forum to make it clear to the world of what the United States was failing to do. And my biggest advice for those who are going is, one, you got to know the rules. You got to know the procedures, for instance, on how to get on get selected as a speaker, because there's really two things that you accomplish when you go to the forum. One is to try to get on the speakers list to have 3 minutes to discuss your cause, but also two, it's an opportunity to build alliances, relationships, and form connections with other indigenous groups there who are probably facing similar issues that you are in their own countries and governments. But it's also an opportunity to meet with, as Andrea said, the state officials. Our experience was when fortunate enough, we had our tribal chairman, Ramler, was selected to speak by the panel for 3 minutes, and where he delivered a great statement about the United States' failure and how it was violating human rights. And the whole room was standing and applauding. And that had a huge impact because we had the United States coming to us after that. They didn't like being publicly called out as violating human rights. We had people from the State Department, representatives from the ambassador, the DOJ, where they were actually calling our people. And that finally helped us get a leg at the negotiating table of where we were coming from, where we built further connections with some of these higher level peoples. So that's the other biggest takeaway. But also, the other biggest takeaway that we learned was it wasn't so much speaking on to the panel, but it was actually speaking with people during breaks in the cafeteria or having lunch, where we learned of other issues they were dealing with. And we formed relationships where even now today we're working with all these other nonprofit organizations, and they're helping us as well. And I think the most fourth biggest point is the media attention that your client can get. We had 10, 15 media contacts getting statements from the chairman. And that in turn, we were able to use as part of a meeting strategy to call out the United States. And I think we do have litigation against the United States. And I think when you add all those things up, it does influence and help our litigation strategy as well. So I highly recommend everyone go there. Just don't sit there and expect people to work for you or results. You got to get out there and hustle. You got to meet people. You got to rub elbows. Hey, I'm so-and-so. I want to get my client. But just be careful, because you might run the risk what happened to me, which is I almost got escorted out by the UN security because I was literally about to fight them because they wouldn't let me sign in for Chairman Ramler as a speaker because the flight was delayed. Thank God for tribal leaders who were supporting me, but also Jennifer. I think her diplomatic skill came out and we were able to get it resolved. So but that was our experience, and happy to answer any questions.
Great, thanks so much, Chase. I'm glad you didn't get kicked out. Glad Jennifer helped out with that. And thanks also for mentioning the media attention, because that's something we hadn't heard yet. So I appreciate that. That's a really good point. So in the interest of time, I'm going to turn it right over to Jennifer.
So in addition to being Chase's bodyguard, I participated last year as counsel for the Coalition of Large Tribes. Chairman Marvin Weatherwax participated as part of the Blackfeet Nation delegation. And so my comments and reflections really go back to what Ambassador Harper mentioned at the outset, which is managing expectations. Managing expectations for tribal leaders of U.S. federally recognized tribes is difficult in that construct, because it's just fundamentally not an institution that recognizes the sovereignty, that the true self-determination of U.S. tribes, and treats everyone as an equal playing field, whether you're a government or another type of indigenous organization. And that can be very frustrating for tribal leaders who are heads of state, who see last year, the president of Chile, he didn't have to wait around all day for 30 NGOs to talk before he got a chance, but our tribal leaders did, and that was very difficult. So I think, as Chase focused on, the little details matter a lot and can make things less difficult for tribal leaders so that they actually do conclude that the juice is worth the substantial squeeze that the UN experience is. So really practical, get in on Sunday and early so that you can get your credentials the day before things start, or be there in line at the absolute earliest in the morning, because that process takes a long time and it's a significant delay if you don't have it. Number 2, get over to the building as soon as possible in the morning, the second it opens, and reserve seats, because there's not enough seating in that room. Wear layers, because it's super blazing hot in there, and the UN just can't figure out heating and cooling. Be prepared that you can't really exit the facility that easily. So you're gonna need to bring your chargers, any food, or eat in the kind of limited cafeteria, coffee shop options. For tribal leaders who are diabetics, that's a big deal. Make sure you've got some granola bars ready to go. Be prepared for the interventions. You have to have them all written out beforehand, and they have to be submitted in advance to the right UN emails. We had a short form and a long form. The short form, 425 words, absolute maximum to plan to get that out. Have your tribal leaders practicing that, because if you just read it at an incredible clip, it's really hard for the translators to keep up, and it's also just less impactful in delivery. But you can package all of your interventions into one longer piece that you then submit in written format, and you can share with media. Very much agree with the point about attending side events, working the hallways, building those collaborations. As Chase mentioned, 2 weeks after the permanent forum last year, we had an intertribal meeting with the White House that all of those leaders who were at the permanent forum attended with San Carlos Apache leadership, and were able to stand together and echo all the same things that we said at the UN. The sign-in for leaders, I think, is very difficult, making sure that you have people in the room. For some reason, they make you sign up all in the one weird closet with no ingress and egress. So you just have to have a ton of patience and recognize that the UN process can be perceived as very insulting to tribal leaders, because there is no priority for tribal elected officials. I also think that there's a fair amount of regional bias, where it seems like the chair has a fair amount of discretion in picking out who gets to speak. And I know that the statement is that they pick from the different UN regions and they try to make it very, very equal, but it seems like there's a long gap between US-based tribal speakers at the permanent forum. So Chairman Rambler was, I think, the second speaker, and I think Chief Barnes and Chairman Weatherwax were number 88 and 91, like, respectively. So, it's a long, long day, and just be prepared to stay there. Also be prepared that you can't sign up for the next one until sometime toward the end of the preceding action items. So you have to just stay in that room and have all your cell phones charged so that you can get your leader there to sign up when you need them. And I think on the self-determination front, just a little bit on the themes this year, co-stewardship is a great area of success right now in the Biden administration. And I think that's a good positive note for tribes to highlight, and what it means to have sovereignty with respect to your natural resources and your lands, whether they're on reservation or off reservation. And then also law enforcement. Tribes use the permanent forum as a way to highlight what's going well, but also what's not going well. And law enforcement is the #1 issue for cult tribes right now and how broken that is. And I think using, trying to get as much as we can into the report. And then, we have standing offers from members of Congress that if we can actually get our language into the report, they will read it on the floor of the US Senate. So, and have tribal leaders join them in that. So this is definitely not just a marathon, but an ultra marathon. And we need to approach it in that way, and then take as much as we can away from that and use it in Washington, D.C. and around the country.
Great. Thanks so much, Jennifer. Really appreciate those remarks. And yeah, the speakers list is definitely a challenge getting on that. And, last year they published a schedule, right, of when speakers list would open at different times and that sort of thing. So as we found out, another good tip is to have people who can stand in line beginning as soon as it opens, before it opens, be there standing in line, and someone hold the spot and someone else go get the coffee or water or whatever else the person needs for that. So thank you so much. We're really running out of time. I did want to mention again the roundtable, the State Department roundtable that's coming up. That's on March 14th. And I think Milo put in the chat the link for registering for that, or he will now put that in the chat. And the registration deadline is March 7th. So that's coming right up. There are only 30 speaker slots open for that. And I'm looking here, for some reason, I can't see all our participants, but I'm going to go off agenda a little bit and just say if Michael Arona is still on and would like to say a word or two about the roundtable, please feel free. We would welcome that. Is he gone? I can't tell.
I think he stepped out too, but
oh, okay. Well, maybe I'll open it up then for thoughts on preparing for the roundtable. The State Department did a similar roundtable last year, and maybe if any of our speakers have some thoughts on how to make the best use of that opportunity at the State Department roundtable. For example, I know last year, Kristen and I worked up some language sort of previewing our proposed or recommendations for the permanent forum report. So as a first step, getting those in front of the State Department and trying to gain support that way. So I just want to open up. Any of our speakers want to say a word or two about the roundtable?
Sue, there's just one thing I want to share about the roundtable, which is really to pass on a recommendation that's also come from the Department of Interior's Secretary's Tribal Advisory Committee. We have really seen the State Department rely on the Department of Interior for expertise when it comes to maintaining relationships with tribal nations. But we do believe that their work, especially in the international Indigenous space, would be benefited by Secretary Blinken having his own tribal advisory committee within the State Department. And so that is something we have been trying to push, and if it could be pushed at this roundtable as well, you have the support of the STAC, DOI STAC on that issue.
Thank you, President Gravelle. That's an excellent point. Andrea?
Hi, I just put a note in the chat that we have another online training for the Permanent Forum on March 19th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. We've been doing for many years actually an in-person training. This time it'll be Thursday and Friday, the week before the Permanent Forum, for new delegates in conjunction with the UN Voluntary Fund, Secretariat of the Permanent Forum, Columbia University, and a few other entities. So I will send you the link once they get it to me, so you can distribute it to your participants if you all want a different training. You can't have too much training, I think, for these things, but experience is the best trainer, actually, and that's what we try to share. And it's focused also on how to draft and prepare interventions that are effective and can get you where you want to go. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Andrea. And we will be sending a follow-up email with the link, to the recording of today's webinar or meeting. And yeah, we can include that at that time. So thank you. Anyone else want to chime in on and I'm sorry, I don't know what happened to my screen. I can only see one screen now. I can't see all the participants.
Just a cautionary note, which is at our last session with the State Department, there's a Rio Tinto interloper who will park on the call and refuses to get off, saying he represents the Western Sahara or some nonsense, which last time I checked does not have a government to government relationship with the United States, such as the State Department should be interested in that. But, he just seems intent on making everyone uncomfortable and not leaving the call, and the State Department is not willing to do anything about it. So I would use this as our preparation vehicle and not expect to have a tribal forum with the State Department.
One thing, if I can chime in, is that, we've had a mixed experience with respect to the State Department and the mission in Geneva and so on, sending well-informed senior folks to those meetings with tribal leaders. And some of you were there last year in Geneva, where unfortunately the U.S. mission, well, just sent a non-high level person, I'll say. And so, one point that I would like to push at some point, whether it's explicitly in the meeting or behind the scenes, is that we'd really like to know who's going to attend. If tribal leaders, elected tribal leaders, are going to be at these meetings, then they expect to be able to schedule a meeting with somebody who's knowledgeable, a decision maker, et cetera. And, a lot of that work we can do, and we're already doing. We're already, building these relationships. But I don't want to encourage an elected tribal leader to go to Geneva to meet with an intern. I mean, I think we can expect, a reciprocal relationship. And just to put in my ongoing plug for all of us to maybe reread the reports from the last years and bring up those points again. What have you done since last year on X? What have you done on last year since Y? Whether that's the United States or UN agencies, because I think everyone has said basically how we have to keep the pressure on over time. And it's an ultramarathon, as Jennifer said. So thank you for listening to me.
If I could say one thing real quick about, I think during that roundtable, it would be a good idea to ask for meaningful representation in the United States' seat during the session. During the Obama administration, we had the Domestic Policy Council person from the White House that sat in that seat, that our Native American representative. I definitely hear what you're saying, Jennifer, about not necessarily relying on interior people to fill that seat and to fill those positions. I don't think that's appropriate, but if we could find appropriate Indigenous individuals to participate on behalf of the U.S. and also give them the issues so that they may be, able to respond in a meaningful way to requests from tribal leaders. I think that's also helpful. Thanks.
Excellent points. Thank you so much. I see that we are out of time. So I do want to thank everyone so much for joining us today. We will share the recording of the session so that the information, this great information that was provided today can be shared more widely. And we'll plan to see everyone at the State Department Roundtable on March 14th. Please don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything the implementation project can do to help support. Thanks. Kristen, did you want to say anything?
Thanks, everyone. Take care. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.